It was a crisp October morning in Washington, D.C. when the news broke. Rebecca Stoddard, the brilliant campaign manager who had become the lifeblood of Jonathan Callaway's re-election campaign, was dead. The initial reports were swift and blunt: political strategist found dead in apartment. The media rushed to paint the story as a tragic case of burnout, a woman who had given everything for her career, driven to despair by the mounting pressure of the election. But something didn't sit right. The details were too clean, too perfect. The apartment, located in the prestigious Georgetown district, seemed untouched by the chaos that had enveloped Rebecca's life. It was as if the city had pressed pause for a moment, holding its breath. The police arrived within hours, but it was Detective Sophia Trenton who would soon take the case from there, and she wasn't convinced by the narrative the media had hastily constructed. Sophia had spent her career navigating the shadows of political scandals and public relations cover-ups. She had learned to read between the lines, to see beyond the surface. And the surface, in this case, was all wrong. Sophia stood in Rebecca's apartment, taking in the scene with a quiet, practiced gaze. The room was neat, almost too neat, considering the chaos that must have unfolded in Rebecca's mind in her final moments. The bed was made, the coffee table cleared, but the subtle signs, the ones that escaped the eye of a typical investigator, caught Sophia's attention. The bottles of prescription pills scattered across the kitchen counter didn't match the standard dosage of what Rebecca had been prescribed. They weren't even the right kind of medication. A suicide by overdose, if that was what it was, wouldn't leave these traces behind. Sophia stepped carefully around the room, her eyes scanning for any detail that could unravel the truth. The faint smell of chemicals lingered in the air, and it wasn't coming from any cleaning product. It was something stronger, something dangerous. Poison, perhaps. Her stomach tightened at the thought, but she pushed it aside. She would not jump to conclusions. Not yet. The most chilling part was the positioning of the body. Rebecca's body lay in a way that suggested she hadn't taken the pills on her own accord. There was a lack of desperation in the way she was found. If Rebecca had been suicidal, she would have been frantic, struggling, trying to escape her own pain. But this looked too controlled. Too clean. The silence was deafening. Sophia's mind immediately turned to the people closest to Rebecca. Jonathan Callaway, the high-profile senator, was the first name that came to mind. His campaign was hanging by a thread, and Rebecca had been his most trusted advisor. They had worked tirelessly together, navigating the rough waters of his re-election bid. But there were whispers. Whispers that spoke of something deeper between them, a relationship that went beyond politics. Could that have been the motive? Was it possible that Rebecca's death had been a tragic accident tied to the pressures of the campaign, or had it been something far darker? Sophia glanced at her phone as it buzzed in her pocket. A message from her partner flashed across the screen: "There's a letter. Nasty. Get back to me ASAP." The letter was delivered to Sophia's office just an hour ago, a mysterious note written in bold, uneven strokes. The message was short, chilling in its simplicity: "Rebecca knew too much. End your investigation now, or everyone will know." Sophia's heart skipped a beat as she read it over again. Who would send such a message? Who knew enough to make such a threat? And why was it so urgent? As she left the apartment, her mind buzzed with possibilities. Rebecca's death was no simple tragedy. There were too many unanswered questions, too many dark corners in this city of power, ambition, and secrets. And Sophia, for all her training, couldn't help but wonder, what had Rebecca discovered that was worth killing for? The case was just beginning. But Sophia knew one thing for certain: it would lead her into a web of deception and betrayal, with no one, least of all the Callaways, being completely innocent. And the deeper she dug, the more it became clear, the truth would not come without a price. The clock was ticking. Washington, D.C. is a city built on power, on appearances, and on the politics of personal gain. Every handshake, every gesture, and every word spoken is calculated. And nowhere is that more evident than in the polished halls of Jonathan Callaway's campaign headquarters. Jonathan Callaway was a name on everyone's lips, a senator in his prime, a man who had crafted his image as a family man, a defender of traditional values. His re-election campaign was a well-oiled machine, a narrative of trust, stability, and patriotism. His speeches were met with applause, his handshake firm, his smile disarming. In public, he was the embodiment of everything that was right about America. In private, however, Jonathan's ambition burned as fiercely as a fire, often overshadowing everything else in his life, his career, his marriage, and even his morals. Jonathan had always been a driven man, with a single-minded focus on achieving power. From his early days as a young lawyer to his ascent in the political world, every step he took was a calculated move toward securing his place among the nation's elite. His reputation as a politician who knew what it took was solidified by his unrelenting work ethic and his ability to balance the demands of the public with the private motives of his closest allies. He was a master at keeping secrets, always 10 steps ahead of those who might threaten his carefully constructed image. But with the pressure of re-election mounting, Jonathan found himself cornered. The stakes were higher than ever, this campaign would define his future. And that future was something he was willing to protect at any cost. At the center of this high-stakes game was Rebecca Stoddard. She had been with him since the beginning of his political rise. More than just a campaign manager, she was his confidant, his strategic partner, and, to some, his closest ally. Rebecca was everything Jonathan needed in a campaign manager: sharp, resourceful, and intensely loyal. She had a reputation for saving floundering political campaigns and had quickly become an invaluable asset to Jonathan's team. Her ability to navigate the intricacies of Washington's political landscape made her a force to be reckoned with. But it wasn't just her professional acumen that made her so indispensable. Over the years, Rebecca had developed a quiet, almost secretive bond with Jonathan, a relationship that blurred the lines between work and personal life. The two shared long nights planning strategy, talking politics, and occasionally, talking about life outside the campaign trail. The tension between them had always been palpable. A spark that neither had fully acknowledged but could not ignore. It had taken months for their professional bond to shift into something more, but by the time the campaign hit full stride, the affair had begun. Their meetings were kept private, hidden away from prying eyes. They exchanged furtive glances during campaign events, coded messages through their assistants, and, when the pressure of the election grew too great, secretive rendezvous in dark hotel suites. Rebecca was drawn to Jonathan's power, his vision, and, undeniably, his charisma. But she was also a woman who knew the stakes. She had her own career to build, her own future to secure. Her initial infatuation had grown into something more complicated. Guilt, desire, and ambition tangled together, leaving her feeling increasingly trapped. She wanted to believe that she mattered to Jonathan, that their relationship meant something more than just a political alliance. But deep down, Rebecca understood the game they were playing. And it was a game Jonathan knew how to win. But there was another side to Jonathan's life, his wife, Mary Ann Callaway. To the public, she was the epitome of grace and poise, a woman who stood by her husband's side through every election, every speech, every victory. The Callaway family was a fixture in Washington, admired for their philanthropy, their charity work, and their perfect public image. Mary Ann was the kind of woman who could make heads turn at a gala or a fundraiser, effortlessly charming everyone she met. But behind the beauty and the smiles was a woman who had been with Jonathan for over 2 decades. Mary Ann had seen the rise and fall of political careers, the late nights, the endless phone calls, and the promises made only to be broken. She had supported Jonathan through thick and thin, but as the years went on, the cracks in their marriage began to show. The late nights spent at the office, the cold distance between them in their home, and the subtle changes in Jonathan's behavior, his increasing irritability, the secretive phone calls, did not go unnoticed by Marianne. She had always been perceptive, always able to read Jonathan better than anyone else. And now, as their marriage seemed to fray at the edges, she found herself questioning whether her suspicions about him were justified. Was he hiding something from her? Or was it just the pressure of the election? The moment she began to sense that something was wrong, Marianne started to investigate. She followed Jonathan on several occasions, but the more she dug, the more she felt that the answers she was looking for might destroy her marriage, and perhaps her entire world. But in the back of her mind, Marianne knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going to let Jonathan's secret life ruin her. She would protect her family's reputation at all costs. And if it meant confronting Rebecca Stoddard to get the truth, so be it. As the campaign drew closer to Election Day, the tension among the Callaways reached a breaking point. With every passing day, Jonathan, Rebecca, and Marianne's fates became more entwined, and none of them could foresee just how dangerous their tangled web of secrets would become. The truth, hidden beneath layers of ambition, power, and deception, was about to be exposed. The stakes had never been higher. And the game was far from over. As the campaign gathered momentum, so did the clandestine relationship between Jonathan Callaway and Rebecca Stoddard. It was a delicate balancing act, each of them carefully walking the fine line between professional loyalty and personal temptation. The stakes of the election were so high, the pressure so overwhelming, that the affair, at first an unspoken bond between two people, soon became something deeper, something neither could deny. Their professional relationship had always been the foundation of their connection. Rebecca was Jonathan's most trusted strategist, a force of nature in the campaign world, capable of seeing solutions where others saw only problems. But what began as mutual respect for each other's abilities slowly transformed into something more dangerous. Late-night strategy sessions turned into long, whispered conversations behind closed doors. The discussions about policy and voter demographics inevitably gave way to more personal exchanges, about childhood memories, dreams for the future, and the loneliness they both shared despite their seemingly perfect lives. There was a magnetic pull between them, a force neither could resist. And as the election drew nearer, their time together became more frequent, more intimate. Their private meetings were kept hidden from prying eyes, in remote corners of Washington, D.C., in dimly lit hotel suites, and later, in the solitude of Rebecca's Georgetown apartment, a sanctuary where their professional and personal lives could collide without fear of discovery. They whispered sweet nothings between sessions of discussing polling data, their hearts racing as they touched for the first time, their emotions raw, a stark contrast to the polished, calculating persona they both displayed to the world. But with every stolen moment came a price they were both beginning to understand all too well. For Jonathan, the affair was both an indulgence and a risk. He had always been the picture of family values, a public figure who had built his career on promises of trust and integrity. His political life was meticulously constructed, every speech, every gesture carefully calculated. His marriage to Marianne was a cornerstone of his image, his perfect family life the bedrock on which his career had been built. But with each passing day, his feelings for Rebecca grew stronger, and the guilt he felt for betraying Marianne began to gnaw at him. Jonathan had always believed that ambition was the driving force behind everything he did. But now, standing in the quiet moments with Rebecca, he realized how much more he needed her. It wasn't just about politics. It wasn't just about power. The connection they shared was real, tangible, and it consumed him in ways he had never imagined. The affair had become more than just a distraction, it had become an addiction. And with each kiss, each whispered promise, Jonathan found it harder to focus on the campaign, harder to push Rebecca out of his mind. Rebecca, for her part, was struggling with her own demons. She had always been a woman of ambition, a woman who prided herself on her ability to thrive in the cutthroat world of politics. But now, she was caught in a whirlwind of emotions that made her question everything she had worked for. At first, the affair had seemed like a harmless indulgence, a fleeting escape from the high stakes of the campaign. But as time passed, Rebecca found herself falling deeper into the emotional mire she had tried so hard to avoid. She wasn't just in love with Jonathan, she was also terrified. Terrified of the consequences if their secret ever came to light. The thrill of their hidden moments was intoxicating, but it came with a constant undercurrent of fear. Fear of losing everything. Fear of the public fallout. Fear of how it would shatter not just her career, but her life. Rebecca had always been careful. She was the one who had fixed broken campaigns, who had resurrected political careers from the ashes. She had prided herself on her professionalism, on her ability to keep her personal life separate from her work. But now, with Jonathan, those lines had blurred beyond recognition. Every moment with him was both a gift and a curse. She knew she was playing a dangerous game, one that could destroy everything she had worked for. But she couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when everything she had built, the trust, the connection, the passion, was hanging by a thread. Meanwhile, Marianne had begun to sense that something was amiss. Her intuition, honed over years of marriage to Jonathan, told her that there was more to his behavior than the strain of the campaign. She had seen it before, the late nights at the office, the secretive phone calls, the distant look in his eyes when he returned home. Something was different, and it wasn't just the pressure of the election. At first, Marianne tried to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of her mind. She told herself it was just stress, just the demands of the campaign. But as the weeks went by, her suspicions grew stronger. The small signs were adding up: Jonathan's increasingly erratic behavior, his reluctance to talk about his day, the subtle changes in his body language when he was near Rebecca. It was impossible to ignore any longer. She knew something was wrong. Marianne wasn't the kind of woman to sit idly by when something threatened her family. She was calculating, composed, and sharp as a tack. The signs were there, too many to ignore. And while she hadn't yet gathered all the evidence she needed, the thought that Jonathan might be hiding an affair was impossible to shake. If her suspicions were true, it would mean the end of her marriage, and it would ruin Jonathan's campaign. She would lose everything. But Marianne wasn't one to confront things recklessly. She would bide her time. She would wait until she knew the full truth, until she had the evidence to expose the betrayal. In the dark corners of Washington, D.C., beneath the polished facades of power, the threads of deception were tightening. The affair between Jonathan and Rebecca was no longer just a secret, it was a ticking time bomb. The pressure was mounting on all sides, and each day brought them closer to the inevitable moment when the truth would be forced into the open. Rebecca's conflict, torn between love and ambition, between loyalty and guilt, grew more intense. And Jonathan, for all his political prowess, was losing control of the situation. Neither of them could anticipate just how much their actions would cost them, nor how the fragile balance they had carefully cultivated would collapse. The tension in Jonathan Calloway's campaign office was palpable. The weight of the election was bearing down on him, but there was something else that consumed his mind more than any poll or rally. Rebecca's death had thrown him off balance. He had buried his emotions in work, but every moment of quiet, every fleeting thought, pulled him back to the secret he had fought so hard to keep. As the campaign neared its final stretch, Jonathan couldn't help but wonder, how much longer could he keep his world intact? For Rebecca, the mounting pressure had become suffocating. After receiving the threatening letter, she had spent days in a haze of paranoia, watching her every step, feeling the walls close in around her. Every glance from a colleague, every ringing phone, felt like a direct attack. Could someone have been watching them? Could someone else know about her affair with Jonathan? The fear that had started as a mere whisper now dominated her thoughts. She had tried to push it all away, to focus on the campaign, but it was no use. The darkness of the secret she carried was closing in. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of managing crisis after crisis in the campaign, Rebecca found herself alone in her apartment. The silence in the room felt almost suffocating as she opened the envelope again, reading the threatening letter over and over. Each word was etched into her mind, a constant reminder of what was at stake. Her heart raced as she realized just how close the danger was. If this secret was exposed, if anyone found out about her relationship with Jonathan, it would end both their careers. Worse, it could destroy everything they had worked for. As Rebecca paced the apartment, her mind began to race with possibilities. She could tell Jonathan about the letter, but what good would it do? He would reassure her, just as he always did. But deep down, she knew that the consequences were far beyond what either of them could control. They were teetering on the edge of disaster. In the midst of her anxiety, a knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts. She hesitated for a moment before walking cautiously to the door. To her shock, it was Marianne Calloway standing on the other side. The last person Rebecca ever expected to see standing there. Marianne was calm, composed, her appearance as flawless as ever, but her eyes, those eyes, spoke volumes. "I need to speak with you," Marianne said quietly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Rebecca's pulse quickened. What did Marianne know? Did she suspect? I don't understand. What are you doing here?" Rebecca stammered, her mind racing. Marianne didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I know about you and Jonathan," she said, her voice cold, steady. "I've known for some time." The words hit Rebecca like a punch to the stomach. She couldn't breathe. Her thoughts scrambled as she tried to make sense of what was happening. "I'm not here to accuse you," Marianne continued, her tone never faltering. "I just want the truth. I know the affair has been going on for months, and I need to know why. Why my husband? Why now, of all times?" Rebecca opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The guilt was overwhelming. Her heart hammered in her chest. How much had Marianne known? How long had she suspected? "I never wanted this to happen," Rebecca whispered, her voice breaking. It just did. I didn't mean for it to get this far. I swear to you, I never wanted to hurt you." Marianne's eyes narrowed slightly, but she remained quiet. She was watching Rebecca, studying her, as though trying to read between the lines of her words. After what felt like an eternity, she spoke again. "Do you think I'm stupid?" she asked, her voice suddenly sharp. "I've watched my husband for years, and I've seen the way he's changed. The late nights, the phone calls, the tension in the air. I knew something was wrong. And I knew it wasn't just the campaign. But I refused to believe it. I couldn't. But now I see it. And now you're standing here, telling me you never meant to hurt me." Marianne's voice wavered for a brief moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "Do you understand what you've done?" she asked, her eyes cold. "You think you're the only one who's been hurt here? You think Jonathan cares about you more than his career, more than his image? You've made a mistake, Rebecca. And now we're both going to pay for it." Rebecca opened her mouth, but before she could respond, Marianne cut her off. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Rebecca's mind spun. What was Marianne asking? Was she threatening her? What did she mean by "we're both going to pay for it"? "I'm not here to make threats, Rebecca," Marianne said, her gaze locking with Rebecca's. "But I've been in this game long enough to know how it's played. And if you think Jonathan is going to risk everything for you, then you're wrong." Rebecca felt her stomach churn. The walls were closing in faster than she could process. "What do you want from me?" she asked, barely able to keep her voice steady. Marianne smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "I want you to stop. I want you to end this affair, for good. If you don't, I will make sure that every person in Washington knows about it. I'll make sure the campaign is over, and Jonathan's career with it." Rebecca stood there, frozen. She had no idea what to say, no idea how to get out of this. For the first time in months, she felt truly cornered. There was nowhere left to turn. "I can't," Rebecca whispered. "I can't just walk away from him." "You don't have a choice," Marianne said softly. "The only choice you have is how you want to play this. If you love your career, your reputation, your life, then end it now." The words hung heavy in the air. Marianne turned and walked toward the door, pausing just before she stepped out. "Remember, Rebecca," she said, her voice calm, but with an edge of finality. "I'm not just his wife. I'm a Calloway. And we don't lose." With that, she was gone. Rebecca was left standing in the middle of the apartment, the weight of Marianne's words crushing her chest. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know who she could trust anymore. Her world, which had once seemed so carefully crafted, was now unraveling, piece by piece. The affair, the campaign, her future, everything was at stake. And no matter how hard she tried to fight it, the truth was closing in. The game had changed. And now, there would be no turning back. The pressure of the election had reached a boiling point. With just weeks to go before Election Day, Jonathan Calloway was consumed by a whirlwind of campaign rallies, speeches, and late-night strategy sessions. On the surface, everything appeared under control, his message was resonating with voters, the polls were leaning in his favor, and his carefully cultivated image as a family man remained intact. But beneath the facade, cracks had begun to form, and they were spreading faster than he could contain. Jonathan's thoughts often drifted to Rebecca, and in moments of quiet, when the world around him slowed to a near halt, he found himself wondering what his life would be like without the weight of his secrets. The affair, once something that seemed like an exciting, albeit dangerous, diversion, had now grown into something far more significant, far more consuming. Jonathan had always been a man of control, but now, he felt like a puppet, caught in a web of deceit, with each thread pulling him deeper into a darkness he couldn't escape. Rebecca, too, had never felt more trapped. After her confrontation with Marianne, she had tried to focus on the campaign, but her mind was constantly clouded by the consequences of her actions. The letter, the threats, and Marianne's ultimatum loomed over her, suffocating her. She had tried to push Marianne's words aside, tried to convince herself that there was still time to make things right, but the weight of it all became unbearable. She felt cornered, lost in the chaos of her own choices. She could end it with Jonathan, could walk away from the affair, but could she really give up everything they had shared? And if she did, would it even matter? The truth was, she no longer knew who she was without the campaign, without Jonathan, without the lies. That evening, as the campaign office buzzed with last-minute preparations for a major fundraiser, Rebecca received a phone call that would change everything. Her hands trembled as she answered, her mind already racing with the possibilities of who it could be. But when she heard the voice on the other end, her heart sank. "Rebecca, it's done," the voice said, barely above a whisper. It was Jonathan's assistant, a man who had been with him for years, someone who knew more than he let on. He was careful, meticulous, and he had just delivered the final blow. "Jonathan's on his way to the event, but you need to meet him. Now." Confusion flooded Rebecca's mind. "What are you talking about? Meet him where? There's no time. Just get to the hotel. You know the one." The connection went dead before she could ask anything more. In a daze, Rebecca grabbed her coat and rushed out of the office, her pulse pounding in her ears. She didn't know what this meant, but the urgency in the assistant's voice had struck a chord deep within her. Something had shifted. Something was going terribly wrong. When she arrived at the hotel, the familiar sight of the grand ballroom in its final stages of preparation felt surreal. The glittering lights, the hum of voices, the noise, it was all a blur. She barely noticed the guests filtering in, the workers setting up the last touches of the decor. All she could think about was Jonathan. He was here somewhere, preparing to face the public, to put on the smile that hid the man he had become behind closed doors. And there, in the back hallway, she found him. Jonathan stood alone, staring out the window, his silhouette framed by the city's dimming lights. For a moment, they just looked at each other, the silence between them louder than any words they had ever shared. The weight of their affair, the betrayal, the lies, they hung heavily in the air. "I can't do this anymore, Jonathan," Rebecca said, her voice a mixture of anger and desperation. "I can't keep hiding. I can't keep living like this." Jonathan didn't turn to her immediately. He stood there, frozen in thought. Finally, he spoke, his voice strained, his back still turned to her. "I know. I know it's been a mess. But we have to finish this. We have to make it through the election first." "I can't keep pretending," Rebecca insisted, her breath catching. "This has gone too far. We're both going to lose everything." Jonathan turned slowly, meeting her gaze for the first time that night. There was something cold in his eyes, something she hadn't seen before. A distance, a hardness. "Do you think I don't know that?" he snapped. "I've been living in a constant state of fear since we started this. I can't lose everything. Not now. Not when I'm so close." Rebecca's heart sank. This wasn't just about them anymore, it was about him, about his career, his power. And she was nothing more than a tool in his game. Before she could respond, the door opened behind them, and Jonathan's assistant entered, his face pale. "There's been an incident," he said quickly, rushing toward Jonathan. "It's Rebecca, she's..." But the words didn't need to be said. The phone call, the cryptic message, the sense of dread, it all came crashing down in that moment. A moment that would change everything. Rebecca didn't hear the rest of the words. She barely felt the shock, the rush of adrenaline that pushed her into motion. The air felt thick, suffocating. Before anyone could react, her body gave way to the stress and exhaustion of the past few weeks, and she collapsed. The room went into a blur of frantic activity as paramedics rushed to her side, but it was already too late. Rebecca Stoddard was dead. The media would later label it as a tragic overdose, but those who had seen her in her final moments knew better. There was more to this than just a broken woman at the end of her rope. There were secrets buried deep beneath the surface. And as the first responders carried her away, the truth began to unravel. Jonathan stood there, numb, the enormity of his actions dawning on him too late. Marianne, watching from the sidelines, knew the game had changed. The affair had been exposed, not by Rebecca's confession, but by her untimely death. And in that moment, the price of their secrets was paid in full. But the question remained, who would be left standing in the aftermath of the tragedy? And how much more would they have to sacrifice to keep their lives intact? The campaign, the lies, the power, all of it was hanging by a thread. And now, with Rebecca gone, there was no one left to protect them from the truth. The news of Rebecca Stoddard's death spread like wildfire through Washington, D.C. In the blink of an eye, the tragedy became the centerpiece of every newscast, every social media feed, and every political conversation. The initial reports framed it as a simple, albeit tragic, overdose, a victim of the relentless pressure of the campaign trail. But for Detective Sophia Trenton, the case didn't sit right. She had seen enough deaths in this city to know when something was off, and Rebecca's death was far too neat, too conveniently timed. Sophia's first priority was the scene of the death. Rebecca's apartment, a sleek and minimalistic space in the heart of Georgetown, had been meticulously arranged, almost as if someone had taken care to hide the evidence. At first glance, everything appeared to point to a woman who had simply cracked under pressure. But Sophia wasn't convinced. The lack of signs of an overdose, no signs of a struggle, no real history of substance abuse, and the strange chemical smell lingering in the air, immediately raised her suspicions. The toxicology report came back inconclusive at first, with no immediate signs of foul play. But Sophia had an instinct that wouldn't let her ignore the glaring gaps in the case. There were too many unanswered questions. She pored over Rebecca's medical records, and something caught her eye, a series of prescriptions that didn't match the bottles found in the apartment. Some of the drugs Rebecca had been prescribed were completely different from what was present at the scene. The pills found in her apartment were not her usual prescription, and they didn't fit the typical profile of an overdose victim. Sophia's mind raced as she considered the implications. This wasn't a simple suicide or overdose. There was a deliberate effort to frame Rebecca's death as something it wasn't. The more she dug, the more she began to suspect that Rebecca had known something important enough to get her killed. The next step was clear: she needed to investigate the people closest to Rebecca. And that meant starting with Jonathan Calloway and his wife, Marianne. The first interview was with Jonathan. His appearance before Sophia was nothing like the cool, collected politician that people saw on TV. He was a mess, his face pale, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep, his nerves frayed. He looked like a man on the brink of collapse, struggling to keep it together in the wake of Rebecca's death. Sophia could feel the guilt radiating off him, but she also saw the cold calculation lurking in his eyes. This was a man who knew how to lie, how to control the narrative. "She was my most trusted advisor," Jonathan said in a hoarse voice, his gaze locked firmly on the floor. "I never wanted this. I never wanted any of this to happen. But Rebecca, she was under so much pressure. We all were." Sophia listened closely, her sharp eyes studying every flicker of emotion, every hesitation in his voice. But despite his performance, something was off. Jonathan's grief felt rehearsed, almost like he was playing the part of the heartbroken boss who had lost his loyal campaign manager. What bothered Sophia most was the way he constantly deflected, refusing to talk about the nature of his relationship with Rebecca, despite the obvious tension in the room. When she pressed him on the affair, Jonathan's reaction was one of panic. His voice cracked as he denied everything, his hands shaking as he spoke. Rebecca and I were close, yes. But we were colleagues. That's all it was. The campaign was everything to both of us. That's all it ever was." Sophia didn't buy it. She had seen enough to know when someone was lying, and Jonathan's unease only confirmed her suspicion. But there was something else, something bigger, that made her uneasy. If Jonathan and Rebecca had truly been just colleagues, then why had Rebecca been so terrified in the days leading up to her death? Why had she felt the need to send a threatening letter to Sophia, a letter warning her to back off? The second interview was with Marianne Calloway. It was clear from the moment Sophia met her that Marianne was not someone who would crack under pressure. She was poised, confident, and calculating. Despite the tragedy surrounding her, she carried herself with an unsettling calmness. If anything, she appeared more in control than ever. "I know why you're here," Marianne said as soon as Sophia entered the room, her voice cool and composed. "You think Jonathan is somehow involved in Rebecca's death, don't you?" Sophia didn't answer right away. She simply observed, watching Marianne closely. Her calm demeanor was at odds with the emotional chaos that had unfolded in the wake of Rebecca's death. It was too composed. Too rehearsed. Marianne didn't miss a beat. "I knew something was wrong. I knew my husband had been hiding something, but I never wanted to believe it. When I saw Rebecca's body, I didn't know whether to feel relief or rage." Relief? The word struck Sophia, and her eyebrows furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean by relief?" she asked carefully, her voice steady. Marianne's expression didn't change, but her eyes hardened. Rebecca had been a threat to everything. She was close to Jonathan, yes. But she was also a threat to our family. To everything we had worked for. When I confronted her, I gave her an ultimatum: end the affair, or face the consequences. But she didn't listen. And now look where we are. Sophia froze. The truth was finally starting to surface. Marianne's calmness was terrifying. She was too sure of herself, too confident in her control over the situation. And the more she spoke, the more it became clear, Rebecca had known something worth killing for. She had been caught in a game between Jonathan and Marianne, both willing to go to any lengths to preserve their secrets. Sophia left the interview feeling more certain than ever that this case was far from over. Marianne's confession was chilling, but it only opened the door to more questions. Had Jonathan truly been innocent, or had he been complicit in Rebecca's death? Was Marianne's cold demeanor the result of grief, or was it something much darker? The investigation had just begun. But as Sophia dug deeper, the twisted web of lies and deceit only grew more complicated. The political game Jonathan and Marianne had been playing was far more dangerous than anyone had imagined, and now, it seemed, the only way to unravel the truth was to expose their darkest secrets. The clock was ticking, and Sophia could feel the weight of the truth bearing down on her. The real story had yet to be told, and it would require everything she had to uncover it. The days that followed Rebecca's death were a blur of press conferences, police statements, and increasingly fervent speculation. The story of her tragic overdose quickly dominated the media, but behind the scenes, the real story was beginning to emerge. Detective Sophia Trenton continued to dig into the layers of lies and deceit that had surrounded Rebecca's life and her untimely death. And with every new discovery, the picture became clearer. Rebecca hadn't just been a casualty of a high-pressure campaign, she had been silenced because she knew too much. Sophia had spent days piecing together the fragments of the story. Jonathan Calloway, in his grief, had continued to push his narrative. Rebecca was a loyal campaign manager, nothing more, nothing less. But as the evidence mounted, Sophia knew this was far from the truth. It had been no accident. Rebecca had been killed, and the players involved were far closer to her than anyone could have imagined. The investigation uncovered the truth behind the affair. Jonathan had been involved with Rebecca for months. But it wasn't just the affair that had led to her death. The political stakes, the hidden ambitions, and the secrets they all carried had created a toxic environment where no one was safe. Rebecca had threatened to expose the truth, and in the cutthroat world of Washington, D.C., people didn't simply expose secrets, they erased them. Sophia had already gathered enough evidence to suspect both Jonathan and Marianne were involved in the conspiracy to silence Rebecca. But the final piece of the puzzle came from an unlikely source, Rebecca's own hidden recordings. Just before her death, Rebecca had begun documenting the growing tension between her and the Calloways. In a chilling final act, she had captured the conversations that took place behind closed doors, including those with Jonathan and Marianne. The recordings revealed the depths of the manipulation and betrayal that Rebecca had endured. Jonathan's promises of a future together were empty, built on the fragile foundation of political ambition. And Marianne, the seemingly poised and controlled wife, had been the mastermind behind the decision to end Rebecca's life, fearing that the affair, and the threat it posed to her family's political dynasty, would be exposed at the worst possible time. Sophia listened to the final recording in her office late one evening, the quiet hum of the city in the background. Rebecca's voice was clear, even in her final moments, as she recounted everything she had uncovered. The recording ended with a chilling sentence, "I know too much. And now, they know that I know." It was the last message Rebecca had left for the world, a warning, a confession, and a plea for someone to understand the truth. With the recordings in hand, Sophia returned to Jonathan and Marianne for one last round of questioning. They had both been expecting this, but the truth was now undeniable. The affair, the lies, the manipulation, it was all laid bare before them. Jonathan, for all his political prowess, had underestimated the cost of his actions. And Marianne, the woman who had always been in control, now stood at the edge of the very empire she had worked so hard to protect, watching it all crumble around her. Rebecca wasn't just a campaign manager to you, was she? Sophia asked Jonathan, her voice steady but firm. She was a threat. A threat to your reputation, to your power. And you didn't hesitate to sacrifice her. Jonathan didn't answer immediately. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape, for a way to salvage what was left. But it was too late. The truth had already come for him. The press had already started piecing together the details, and the story of the affair, of the lengths Jonathan and Marianne had gone to in order to protect their image, was out. Marianne, for all her calculated poise, broke first. Her eyes, which had once shown nothing but cold control, were now filled with fear. Fear not just for herself, but for what this meant for her family, her future. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but there was no denying the weight of her words. "You have no idea what this will cost us," she said, her voice breaking. "Our lives, everything we've worked for, it's all over. It was never supposed to be like this. It wasn't supposed to end this way." Sophia leaned back in her chair, letting the silence fill the room. The damage had been done. There would be no escaping the consequences. The media would have their story, and the public would demand answers. Jonathan's political career was over, and Marianne, despite her attempts to control the narrative, had lost everything. But there was one last question that lingered in the air, unanswered. Did either of them truly feel remorse for what had happened? Or were they simply facing the inevitable consequences of their own ambition? The story of Rebecca Stoddard, Jonathan Calloway, and Marianne Calloway became a national scandal. The revelations of the affair, the cover-up, and Rebecca's tragic end shook the political landscape. Jonathan resigned in disgrace, his career destroyed, his reputation shattered beyond repair. Marianne, once seen as the epitome of grace and poise, was now a symbol of ruthless ambition, willing to do anything to protect her family's legacy. The media coverage was relentless, and while the public's attention shifted to the next scandal, the damage to the Calloway family was irreversible. The truth had come to light, but the question remained, was it enough? Sophia Trenton, the determined detective, had uncovered the darkest corners of a political dynasty, but as she watched the downfall of Jonathan and Marianne, she couldn't help but wonder, how many other stories like this were out there? How many people had been silenced, their lives destroyed by the same ambition and lies that had brought the Calloways to their knees? The web of lies, betrayal, and political ambition in this story shows just how far people are willing to go to protect their reputations and careers. But at what cost? What do you think about the actions of Jonathan and Marianne? Were they justified in their attempts to cover up their secrets, or was their downfall inevitable? And how do you think Rebecca's story should have ended? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done if you were in their shoes? Would you have risked everything to keep the truth hidden, or would you have come clean? We want to hear from you. Leave your comments and subscribe for more stories that expose the darker side of ambition.